At Rosy's Café, 84-year-old Frank Delaney, a reclusive Vietnam veteran, faces mockery from Kyle, a brash young man, for wearing his faded Marine uniform. The cafe falls silent as Frank's dignity holds firm. Unbeknownst to Kyle, whispers of Frank's heroism spread among patrons. A search reveals his silver star and purple heart. A young woman, Melissa, calls her Marine uncle, sparking a chain of events. As Frank gazes at a letter from his late wife, Eleanor, a black SUV arrives. Who waits outside? Why do Marines salute him? The truth of Frank's past is about to unravel, leaving everyone stunned. Subscribe to uncover tales of courage and redemption like Frank's. Share this story to inspire faith in doing what's right. Your support amplifies unsung heroes' voices. Join our community, hit that subscribe button, and let's honor those who change lives quietly. Thank you. On a radiant Memorial Day morning in Milbrook, Ohio, Frank Delaney adhered to a ritual etched into the fabric of his existence for 23 unwavering years. At 84, time had carved deep lines into his face and slowed his steps, yet it could not erode the disciplined posture of a Marine. Each year, he meticulously polished his weathered combat boots, pressed his faded Marine Corps jacket until it held a semblance of its former crispness, and set his service cap atop his thinning white hair with a reverence that spoke of duty and loss. Frank lived alone in a modest apartment at a veterans complex, a quiet figure known to his neighbors as a man of few words but profound dignity. He deflected inquiries about his service with a polite smile, declined invitations to veterans gatherings, and kept the stories behind his medals locked away in the silence of his heart. What remained unspoken was the sacred pilgrimage he undertook each Memorial Day to Rosy's Café, the same place where he and his late wife, Eleanor, had celebrated his return from Vietnam in 1969. After her death, Frank continued this tradition alone, a solitary act of remembrance for his fallen comrades and the woman whose steadfast love had anchored him through 3 perilous deployments. This particular morning, Rosy's Café buzzed with an unusual energy. College students, freed by the holiday weekend, filled tables with laughter and chatter. Families with young children crowded into booths, their voices mingling with the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation. Frank entered quietly, his movements deliberate, each step a negotiation with the chronic pain he refused to acknowledge. He settled at his usual corner table by the window, where a beam of May sunlight illuminated swirling dust motes, casting a soft glow on his weathered face. Martha, a waitress who had served at Rosy's for over a decade, recognized him instantly. She didn't know his name or the weight of his past, but she knew him as the solitary man in the Marine jacket who appeared every Memorial Day, ordering nothing but a black coffee. "Good morning, sir," she said warmly, placing a menu before him. "Just coffee, please," Frank replied, his voice low but steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had long ago learned to command without raising his tone. "Black." As Martha turned toward the counter, the bell above the door chimed sharply. 3 young men in their mid-20s burst in, their laughter cutting through the cafe's ambiance like a blade. The leader, Kyle Brennan, a 26-year-old financial advisor with a polished appearance and an air of entitlement, scanned the room for a table. His expensive watch glinted under the fluorescent lights, and his carefully styled hair framed a smirk that widened as his eyes landed on Frank. The old man's faded uniform, a relic of a bygone era, seemed to amuse him. "Check out G.I. Joe over there," Kyle said loudly, his voice carrying to nearby tables. "Bet he dusts that thing off once a year for the free pancakes." His friends laughed, though their discomfort was palpable, their glances darting toward Frank, who sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Kyle, emboldened by the lack of response, raised his voice further. "Bet you wear that for the discounts, right?" he called out, directing his mockery at Frank. The cafe fell into a heavy silence. Conversation stopped abruptly. Forks hovered midair, and even the sizzle of the kitchen seemed to fade. Frank's pale blue eyes, which had once pierced through the dense jungles of Vietnam to spot danger, remained fixed on the window. His face revealed nothing, no flicker of anger, no trace of humiliation, only the stoic resolve of a man who had endured far greater trials than a stranger's taunt. Inside, though, his heart churned. The jacket, worn thin by time, was more than fabric. It was a tapestry of sacrifice, woven with memories of brothers lost and a love that had sustained him through the darkest nights. Each Memorial Day, slipping it on felt like donning armor, a shield against the grief that threatened to overwhelm him. Yet he refused to let this young man's words pierce that armor. He had faced mortars and ambushes. A careless insult was nothing. Martha stood frozen, coffee pot in hand, her cheeks flushing with secondhand embarrassment. She wanted to speak, to defend the quiet old man she had come to respect in her own small way, but her voice caught in her throat. The manager, peering from the kitchen, hesitated, unsure how to restore the cafe's warmth. At a nearby table, an elderly couple exchanged a glance laden with meaning. The woman, her silver hair catching the light, leaned toward her husband. "That's him," she whispered, her voice trembling with conviction. "The one who pulled you out of that trench. I'd know him anywhere." Her husband, his eyes narrowing as he studied Frank, felt a wave of recognition crash over him. Memories of a muddy, blood-soaked trench in 1969 flooded back. Chaos, gunfire, and a young Marine who had risked everything to drag him to safety. His heart swelled with gratitude and awe, tempered by the disbelief that this hero now sat alone, mocked by a stranger who could not fathom the weight of his service. Kyle, sensing the room's unease but misinterpreting it as support, chuckled again, though his bravado wavered. "Guess he can't hear me," he stage whispered to his friends. "Or maybe that uniform's from a costume shop." The words hung in the air, hollow and cruel. Frank, with a slow, deliberate motion, placed his service cap on the table. His gnarled fingers, scarred from shrapnel and years of labor, curling around the coffee mug Martha had set down with trembling hands. Each movement was a quiet act of defiance, a refusal to let Kyle's ignorance diminish him. In his mind, he was back at the cafe in 1916, Eleanor's laughter filling the air as they shared a simple meal, her hand warm in his. The memory anchored him, a reminder of why he endured, why he returned here year after year. Outside, a black SUV with government plates rolled to a stop, its dark windows reflecting the morning sun. The cafe's bell would soon chime again, heralding the arrival of figures who knew exactly who Frank Delaney was. A man whose quiet presence belied a legacy of courage that demanded respect. The air in Rosy's cafe was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the weight of unspoken judgment. Kyle's mocking words lingered like a sour note, his taunts aimed at the elderly Marine veteran seated alone at a small table near the window. Frank Delaney, his white hair stark against the crisp lines of his dress uniform, sat with a stillness that seemed to defy the chaos around him. His posture was rigid, a relic of decades spent in service, but his eyes, clouded with age yet sharp with memory, were fixed on something far beyond the cafe's walls. The sting of Kyle's words, dripping with sarcasm and air-quoted gratitude, cut deeper than the young man could know. To the casual observer, Frank appeared unmoved, but those closest to him caught the faint tremor in his right hand, the subtle clench of his raw jaw as he wrestled with emotions he had long learned to bury. In a corner booth, a middle-aged man named Tom sat with his wife Ellen, their breakfast forgotten as Kyle's voice carried across the room. Tom's brow furrowed, his unease growing with each of Kyle's jabs. Unable to ignore the scene, he slipped his smartphone from his pocket, his fingers swiftly typing Frank Delaney Marine into the search bar. The results loaded and his breath caught. Sergeant Francis Frank Delaney, USMC, veteran of Korea and Vietnam, Purple Heart, Silver Star for Valor in Combat. A black and white photograph accompanied the entry, a younger Frank, stern and unyielding in his dress blues, his posture as impeccable then as it was now. Tom's eyes widened, a mix of reverence and disbelief washing over him. He tilted the screen toward Ellen, whose hand flew to her mouth as she read. "He's a hero," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible but heavy with awe. He angled the phone so nearby patrons could see, and murmurs of respect rippled through the small cluster of tables, a quiet rebellion against Kyle's ignorance. At the counter, Melissa, a woman in her late 20s with a kind face and a restless energy, watched the scene unfold with growing distress. Her heart ached for the old man, his solitude and dignity under attack. She couldn't stand by. Slipping out the cafe's glass door, she pressed her phone to her ear, her voice low and urgent. Uncle David, it's Melissa. You need to get to Rosy's Café now. There's a Marine veteran here, elderly, in his uniform, and some jerks harassing him. Called him a fake. She paused, listening to her uncle's response, her eyes darting back toward Frank through the window. Yes, I'm sure. It's Memorial Day, and he's in full dress. White hair, looks like he's been through hell and back. Another pause. No, I don't know him, but you always said we owe them respect, especially today. Her words were fervent, driven by a sense of duty instilled by her uncle, a retired Marine himself. She hung up, her chest tight with hope that help was on the way. Inside, Kyle's friends were growing restless. One, a lanky guy named Mike, checked his watch repeatedly, his discomfort plain. Another, Sarah, buried her face in the menu, her eyes scanning the same line of text over and over as if it could shield her from the tension. Kyle, however, seemed oblivious to the shift in the room's atmosphere. The silent disapproval from other patrons, their glances, their whispers, pressed against him, but his pride was a stubborn thing. He doubled down, his voice louder now. Maybe he's deaf, he said, smirking. Hey, sir, he called to Frank. Thank you for your service. The air quotes were deliberate, and the sharp gasps from nearby tables were immediate. Kyle's bravado faltered for a moment, but he masked it with a laugh, unwilling to admit he'd crossed a line. Frank remained still, his gaze distant, as if anchored to a memory no one else could see. To those watching, he seemed either oblivious or indifferent, but the truth was more complex. Each of Kyle's words was a needle, pricking at wounds Frank had spent decades trying to heal. His right hand trembled slightly, a betrayal of the stoicism he'd mastered in foxholes and battlefields. With a slow, deliberate calm, he reached into his jacket and withdrew a worn, yellowed envelope, its edges frayed from years of careful handling. From it, he pulled a faded photograph and a letter, placing them gently beside his untouched coffee. The photograph captured a young woman with dark hair and a radiant smile, standing in front of Rosy's Café as it looked in the 1960s, its neon sign bold and new. The letter, written in delicate feminine script, was dated May 30th, 1969. If you come home to me, Frank, promise we'll have coffee here every year on this day. I'll wait for you forever if I must. And if I'm gone before you, keep our tradition. Perhaps someday someone will remember. Martha. Martha, the waitress, moved between tables, her arms laden with plates of pancakes and eggs. As she passed Frank's table, her eyes caught the photograph and the letter. The words, though blurred by time, struck her like a thunderbolt. Her throat tightened, and tears welled in her eyes as she pieced it together. This wasn't just a veteran taking advantage of a free coffee on Memorial Day. This was a man keeping a sacred promise, honoring not only his fallen comrades, but a love lost to time. She turned away, blinking rapidly, her heart heavy with the weight of Frank's quiet devotion. Outside, a black SUV pulled up, its tires crunching against the curb. Lieutenant James Cooper, a 32-year-old Marine in civilian clothes, stepped out. He'd been at a Memorial Day service 2 miles away when Melissa's call came through. His aunt's urgency had pulled him here, and as he entered Rosy's, his eyes scanned the room, landing on Frank's unmistakable figure. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by a mix of awe and hesitation. He approached slowly, stopping a respectful distance from Frank's table. Sergeant Delaney, hey, he asked, his voice soft but steady. Frank looked up, his weathered face betraying a moment of confusion before his instincts kicked in. His eyes narrowed slightly, assessing James with the quick, practiced gaze of a combat veteran. Threat, position, intent, all evaluated in seconds. Yes, he said, his voice low but firm. Lieutenant James Cooper, sir. 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines. James straightened, a subtle shift that spoke of pride and respect. A flicker of emotion crossed Frank's face, an acknowledgement of a shared bond, a brotherhood forged in service. Same unit, Frank said softly, almost to himself. I know, sir, James replied. My grandfather served with you. James Cooper, Sr. Frank's eyes widened slightly, a spark of memory igniting. Coop, he said, the nickname slipping out like a ghost from the past, known only to those who'd shared the chaos of war. Good Marine, brave man. Yes, sir, James said, his voice thick with emotion. He told me stories about you my whole life, about Hill 937. The room had grown quieter now, patrons leaning in, sensing the gravity of the moment. Kyle, still lingering near the entrance with his friends, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence eroding. Frank's gaze softened, his thoughts drifting to a time when he and James's grandfather had fought side by side. "Your grandfather," he began, then paused, clearing his throat to steady his voice. "He made it home, okay?" James nodded. "Lived to 82, passed 3 years ago, but he never stopped talking about you, sir, about what you did." His words carried a weight that silenced the room, a testament to a legacy Kyle couldn't begin to understand. Frank Delaney sat at the worn wooden table in Rosy's Café, his fingers tracing the edges of a faded photograph of Eleanor, her smile frozen in time, the weight of decades pressed against his chest, a quiet ache that never quite left him. He'd spent over 50 years dodging the spotlight, slipping away from reunions, medals, and the grateful gazes of those who called him a hero. To him, he was just a man who'd made a promise to the woman he loved, a promise to come home and to bring as many of his brothers in arms with him as he could. Now, as he sat with his cooling coffee, that carefully guarded solitude was unraveling. Lieutenant Cooper, a younger man with a steady want and a voice that carried both respect and urgency, leaned forward. "They stopped looking for you, sir. All of them, eventually. They had to." His words landed softly, but they stirred something deep in Frank, a mix of relief and guilt. He'd wanted it that way, hadn't he? To be left alone, to carry his memories in silence. "I didn't want to be found," Frank admitted, his voice low, almost a whisper. He glanced at the photograph again, Eleanor's eyes anchoring him. "They figured it out in time. But today's different." Cooper's eyes flickered toward the window, where the late morning light spilled across the small town street outside. "They're out there, sir. The survivors, their children, their grandchildren. For decades, they've gathered every Memorial Day, holding out hope you'd show up." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Frank's hand trembled slightly, the first crack in his stoic demeanor. "There can't be many left," he said, his voice barely audible, as if speaking the truth might make it real. "3 of the original squad, sir," Cooper replied gently, "and 27 descendants. They call themselves Delaney's legacy." A ripple of awareness passed through the clink of coffee cups stilled, and the soft hum of conversation faded. Patrons turned their heads, their eyes settling on the elderly man in the faded uniform. He wasn't just a veteran, they realized, but someone whose story carried a weight they couldn't yet grasp. Frank felt their gazes like a physical touch, and for a moment he wanted to shrink back into the shadows. "I don't understand," he said, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. "I was just a sergeant. I did my job." Cooper's voice dropped, laced with reverence. "My grandfather told me about you, sir. Said you were the bravest man he ever knew. Said you went back into that inferno 7 times to pull him out. Said the citation they gave you didn't even come close to capturing what you did that day." Frank's eyes drifted back to Eleanor's photograph, her face a lifeline amidst the flood of memories. The screams, the smoke, the weight of men slung over his shoulders, they all came rushing back. "I promised her I'd come home," he said simply, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Couldn't do that without bringing as many of our boys as I could." Outside, the sound of car doors closing broke the quiet. Frank glanced up, catching sight of more vehicles pulling into the lot. Elderly men, their steps slow and deliberate, emerged with the help of canes, wheelchairs, and younger family members. Their faces, weathered by time, held a shared determination. Cooper stood, extending a hand to Frank. "They've waited a long time for this, sir. Will you meet them?" Frank hesitated, his fingers brushing the creased letter from Eleanor tucked in his pocket. He folded it carefully, as if it were a sacred relic, and placed it back. With a quiet resolve, he slid a $5 bill under his coffee cup, adjusted his service cap, and rose from his seat. Each movement was deliberate, a testament to the dignity he carried despite his 84 years. As Frank approached the door, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. Patrons straightened in their seats, their eyes following him with a mix of awe and respect. Kyle, a young man who'd been joking loudly with his friends moments earlier, pressed himself against the wall, his face pale with sudden understanding. His friends, too, averted their eyes. their earlier bravado replaced by a quiet shame. They were witnesses to something far greater than themselves, and they knew it. Lieutenant Cooper reached the door first, holding it open with a steady hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called to the crowd outside, his voice ringing with pride. "I found him." The wind chimes above the door tinkled softly, a delicate sound that seemed to carry the weight of the moment. Frank paused at the threshold, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. For half a century he'd run from this, from the gratitude, the reverence, the memories. Now it was all catches up to him, and he wasn't sure he was ready. As he stepped outside, 6 Marines in pristine dress blues snapped to attention, forming a corridor of honor on either side of the cafe's entrance. Their movements were flawless, a testament to their training, and their right hands rose in a synchronized salute, held with unwavering precision. Frank's breath caught at the sight, the gesture stirring something deep within him, a pride he'd long buried, mixed with the ache of those who hadn't made it back. Inside the cafe, patrons drifted to the windows, drawn by the unfolding scene. Martha, the waitress who'd served Frank his coffee, pressed a hand to her heart, her eyes glistening. An elderly couple at a nearby table clasped hands tightly, their faces reflecting a shared understanding of sacrifice. The silence was profound, not awkward but sacred, as if words would only diminish the moment. Kyle remained frozen, his earlier laughter now a distant memory. The realization hit him like a wave. This man, this quiet figure in a faded uniform, was no ordinary veteran. His friends stood beside him, their heads bowed, their earlier teasing replaced by a heavy, humbling silence. Beyond the Marines stood 3 elderly men, their postures marked by the unmistakable bearing of combat veterans. Time had taken its toll, white hair, bent frames, and the careful movements of those living with old wounds, but their dignity was unshakable. One sat in a wheelchair, an oxygen tank at his side, his hands trembling as he adjusted his mask. Another leaned heavily on a cane, his knuckles white with the effort. The third stood unaided, though his careful balance betrayed the chronic pain he carried. Behind them, a larger group waited, nearly 30 people, from teenagers to middle-aged adults, all part of Delaney's legacy. Their faces held a quiet reverence, their eyes fixed on the man they'd come to honor. Frank descended the cafe steps slowly, returning the Marine's salute with a crisp gesture that defied his age. As he approached the 3 veterans, the man in the wheelchair removed his oxygen mask with shaking hands. "Sarge," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. "Been a while." Frank's eyes widened, a flicker of recognition breaking through his stoic mask. "Martinez? Raymond Martinez?" The man nodded, tears carving paths down his lined face. 54 years, 2 months, and 17 days, he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But who's counting?" The second veteran stepped forward, his cane tapping softly against the ground. "Williams, sir, Thomas Williams." The third, standing with careful poise, added, "In Jackson, you pulled us all out of that hellhole, every last one of us." Frank stood before them, his composure fraying at the edges. Their faces brought it all back, the chaos, the fear, the desperate determination to save them. He'd carried their weight, both literal and figurative, for decades, but seeing them now alive and surrounded by their families stirred a complex mix of pride and sorrow. He'd kept his promise to Eleanor, but at a cost he rarely allowed himself to dwell on. The crowd watched in silence, their collective breath held as the reunion unfolded. For Frank, the moment was both overwhelming and grounding. These men, these families, they were the reason he'd gone back into the fire, again and again. And now, after all these years, they were here not just to thank him, but to remind him that his actions had rippled through generations. As he stood before them, the weight of his promise to Eleanor felt lighter, if only for a moment, and he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weight of an unfamiliar dread pressed against Frank Delaney's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in decades, not since the jungles of Vietnam. For the first time in years, he felt exposed, as though the quiet life he'd carved out in Ohio was unraveling. He'd overheard whispers earlier, murmurs that Thomas Williams, one of his squad mates, hadn't survived the war. The news had settled like a stone in his gut, heavy with grief and guilt. But then Thomas Williams himself stepped forward, His face lined with age but alive, his eyes carrying the same fierce gratitude Frank remembered from that fateful day. "They pronounced me dead for 6 minutes," William said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "The medics pulled me back from the edge, Frank, and I'm standing here because you got me to that extraction point." The words hit Frank like a tidal wave, stirring memories he'd buried deep. Gunfire, screams, the acrid smell of blood and earth. He wanted to speak, to say something to ease the intensity of the moment, but his throat tightened, and he could only nod. A distinguished figure emerged from the small crowd gathered outside the cafe, his presence commanding immediate respect. Lieutenant Colonel David Clay, in his 60s, wore the crisp uniform of the unit Frank had once called home. His silver hair gleamed under the late afternoon sun, and his eyes held a mix of pride and solemnity. "Sergeant Delaney," Clay said, extending a hand, his voice warm but formal. "We've been searching for you for 3 years." Frank hesitated, his calloused hand hovering before accepting the handshake. Reluctance coursed through him, not out of distrust but from a bone-deep desire to remain unseen, to stay the civilian Francis Delaney, not the war hero others insisted on resurrecting. "I wasn't lost, Colonel," he said, his voice low, almost defiant. Clay's expression softened, a flicker of understanding passing between them. "No, sir, you weren't," he agreed, his tone gentler now. He gestured toward the growing crowd, veterans, families, cafe patrons drawn by the unfolding scene. "But your story, your example, your legacy, it's why we're all here today. In our unit, no one is ever absent, not you, not those who didn't make it home." Clay turned to address the onlookers, his voice carrying the weight of history. In 1969, during some of the fiercest combat of the Vietnam War, Sergeant Frank Delaney's squad was ambushed, trapped in enemy territory. Frank's jaw tightened, his gaze drifting to a distant point beyond the cafe's awning, as if he could see the jungle again. The dense green canopy, the chaos of gunfire, the faces of his men, some forever frozen in his memory. Clay's words pulled him back. Their radio operator was killed, half the squad wounded, with no way to call for help. Sergeant Delaney made a choice. The colonel's voice grew more intense, each word deliberate. He moved through a hail of enemy fire to reach a secondary position where communication might be possible. But when he arrived, he found more wounded Marines stranded and helpless. Frank's hands clenched at his sides, the phantom pain of shrapnel wounds in his legs and back flaring as Clay recounted the day that had defined him and haunted him. He hadn't thought of it as heroism then, only necessity. His men were dying and every second mattered. Clay continued, his voice rising with conviction. Instead of pressing on with his mission, Sergeant Delaney dragged the first wounded Marine back to his squad's position. Then he went back 6 more times. Under relentless enemy fire, with shrapnel tearing into his body, he carried each man to safety. The crowd had fallen silent, the usual hum of street noise fading as if the world itself paused to listen. Even the breeze seemed to still, deferring to the gravity of the story. On his 7th trip, Sergeant Delaney was hit badly, but he still managed to radio the coordinates for evacuation before collapsing. All 7 Marines he saved survived. He was extracted with them, but vanished from the military hospital 3 days later. Frank's chest ached, not from old wounds, but from the rawness of memory. He'd been listed as AWOL, then presumed dead, but he hadn't cared about the military's paperwork. "I had someone waiting for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried in the quiet. "Eleanor, my wife. They'd already told her I was dead. I couldn't let the Corps keep me for debriefings and ceremonies while she was breaking apart." His fingers brushed the pocket of his faded jacket where her last letter rested, its edges worn from years of being carried close. Clay nodded, his eyes reflecting a shared understanding of sacrifice beyond the battlefield. "So you disappeared," he said. "Became Francis Delaney, civilian. Moved to Ohio with Eleanor. Never claimed your Silver Star or your second Purple Heart. Never reached out to your unit. Never sought the recognition you earned." "Recognition doesn't bring back the dead," Frank replied, his voice steady but laced with pain. "And I made her a promise. The promise had been simple but unbreakable. To come home, to build a life together, to never let the war steal more than it already had." He'd kept that vow, even if it meant leaving behind the man he'd been. From the edge of the crowd, a young woman stepped forward, her eyes bright with emotion. Melissa, Lieutenant Cooper's niece, the one who had made the call that brought them all here, spoke with a voice trembling but clear. "You didn't just save my grandfather that day, Mr. Delaney. You saved our whole family. 3 generations are here because of you." Her words struck Frank like a quiet thunderclap, stirring a warmth he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He wanted to deflect, to say it was just what anyone would have done, but the sincerity in her gaze held him silent. Colonel Clay reached into his uniform jacket, producing a small case with a reverence that made the moment feel sacred. "The Marine Corps doesn't forget its own, Sergeant," he said. "Your medals were held in trust, waiting for this day." He opened the case, revealing the silver star and purple heart, their polished surfaces catching the sunlight. "These belong to you, as does our eternal gratitude." As Clay pinned the medals to Frank's worn jacket, the crowd erupted into spontaneous applause, the sound swelling and echoing down the street, a chorus of respect and awe. Frank stood still, his eyes fixed on the medals, their weight heavier than metal, carrying the memories of men lost and lives saved. From the cafe doorway, a young man pushed through, his face flushed with shame. Kyle, barely out of his teens, stopped before Frank and dropped to one knee, his head bowed. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking under the weight of regret. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I was ignorant, disrespectful." Frank studied him, seeing not malice but youth, not defiance but remorse. The boy had mocked his uniform earlier, unaware of its history, and now the truth had humbled him. "Stand up, son," Frank said, his tone firm but kind. Kyle rose slowly, unable to meet Frank's gaze, tears streaking his cheeks. "I didn't wear this uniform for recognition or respect," Frank said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "I wore it for them." He gestured toward the 3 elderly veterans standing nearby, their faces etched with pride and sorrow. "And for those who never came home. And for her." His hand rested on the pocket with Eleanor's letter, a touchstone to the life he'd chosen. The uniform doesn't make the man. Sometimes the man makes the uniform worthy of respect. He extended his hand to Kyle, who accepted it with a shaky grip, his tears falling freely now. "We all make mistakes," Frank added. "It's what we learn from them that matters." As the formal ceremony drew to a close, the gathering transformed into something warmer, more intimate, an impromptu reunion. The 3 surviving squad members clustered around Frank, their voices overlapping with memories of shared hardship and survival. They introduced their families, children and grandchildren who existed because of that day in 1969. Café patrons mingled with Marines, drawn into stories that spanned half a century, tales of courage, loss, and brotherhood. Martha, the cafe owner, moved through the crowd with a tray of fresh coffee, her smile generous and unwavering. "On the house," she insisted, her voice carrying a quiet pride in hosting such a moment. Frank stood among them, the medals glinting faintly on his chest, his heart a tangle of gratitude and grief. He'd never wanted this, reunions, recognition, or applause. But as he looked at the faces around him, he felt Eleanor's presence, her love anchoring him. For her, for his men, for the promises kept, he allowed himself to be seen, if only for today. The weight of decades hung in the air as Catherine Williams, her steps slow but deliberate, wove through the crowd toward Frank Delaney. Her eyes, bright with memory, held a quiet intensity that seemed to pull the world into focus. Behind her husband Thomas trailed, his gait uneven from old wounds, his face etched with the kind of gratitude that words could never fully carry. "You won't recall me," Catherine said softly, her voice trembling, not with age, but with the enormity of the moment. "I'm Catherine Williams. This is Thomas, my husband." She gestured to the man Frank had exchanged a nod with earlier, a fellow veteran whose eyes had briefly locked with his in silent recognition. "You pulled him from that trench all those years ago. The medics swore he'd never walk again, never hold a child of his own. But here we are, 4 children, 11 grandchildren, and a life we owe to you." Thomas stepped forward, his hands trembling as they reached for Frank. The embrace that followed was fierce, a collision of gratitude and survival, as if Thomas had been carrying this moment in his chest for half a century. "I never thought I'd get to say this to your face," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Frank. Thank you for giving me a life I wasn't supposed to have." Frank, already overwhelmed by the day's unexpected tide of recognition, could only nod, his throat tight. The world seemed to blur around him, the chatter of the crowd fading as he looked into Thomas's eyes. "I'm just glad you made it home, Thomas," he managed, his voice low but steady. Inside, his heart churned with a mix of relief and humility, the kind that comes from realizing your actions rippled far beyond what you ever imagined. As the gathering pressed on, Lieutenant Cooper approached Frank once more, his uniform crisp but his demeanor softened by respect. "Sir," he began, "our unit has a tradition. Every Memorial Day we come together to honor the legacy of men like you, men like Sergeant Delaney. It would mean the world if you join us next year." Frank's gaze drifted past Cooper, settling on Rosy's Café across the street, where a corner table stood as a quiet monument to a promise kept. For 23 years he had sat there, faithfully honoring the memory of his beloved Eleanor, her words etched into his soul. "This is where I belong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with the weight of loyalty and loss. Then after a pause, he added, "But maybe you all could join me here instead." Cooper's face broke into a warm smile, his eyes glinting with understanding. "I think we'd like that very much, sir," he replied, and in that moment, a bridge was built between generations, tethered by shared respect. In the year that followed, Frank's life shifted in ways he hadn't foreseen, though he remained steadfastly himself. He stayed in his modest veteran's apartment, a small sanctuary of simplicity, turning down offers of money and fame with the same quiet resolve that had defined him for decades. The only thing he asked for was that Rosy's Café preserve his corner table, not as a shrine, but as a place where stories could live, where veterans could gather and find solace in shared silence. The cafe's owner, a woman with a heart as big as her establishment, went further. A small bronze plaque now marked the table as Frank's, its understated inscription reading, "Veterans always welcome." It wasn't flashy, but it was perfect. A quiet nod to the man who had never sought the spotlight. Each Memorial Day, Rosy's became a haven. Coffee flowed freely for anyone in uniform or flashing a military ID, a gesture that drew veterans young and old. Near the entrance, a framed photograph captured a moment that had seared itself into the town's collective memory. 6 Marines, standing tall, saluting Frank with a reverence that transcended words. The image, shared online by Melissa Cooper, had spread like wildfire, a testament to the power of intergenerational respect. Below the photo, a simple inscription read, "Some heroes never needed a stage. They needed a seat." Those words, unassuming yet profound, seemed to echo Frank's life, a man who had carried his honor with quiet dignity, never asking for applause. Frank himself adjusted slowly to the reluctant fame that followed. He remained a man of few words, especially about the war, but he began accepting invitations to local schools. There he didn't spin tales of battlefield heroics. Instead, he spoke of promises kept, of the quiet integrity that comes from doing right even when no one's watching. His words landed softly but deeply, planting seeds in young minds about what it means to live with purpose. Inside, though, Frank wrestled with the attention. He hadn't saved Thomas or the others for recognition. He'd done it because it was right. Yet the gratitude he now received stirred something in him, a sense that perhaps Eleanor's hope that someone would remember had come true. Meanwhile, Kyle Brennan, the young man whose careless mockery had sparked Frank's moment of recognition, was on his own journey of redemption. That Memorial Day had left him raw, his shame a heavy weight that forced him to confront the privilege he'd taken for granted. He began volunteering at the Veterans Center where Frank lived, at first out of guilt, a kind of self-imposed penance. But over time, something shifted. The work became genuine, a way to connect with men and women whose sacrifices he'd once failed to grasp. On quiet evenings, he and Frank would sit in the common room, the older man sharing carefully chosen memories, not of combat, but of Eleanor, her laughter, her letters, the way she'd made him believe in a future worth fighting for. Through those stories, Kyle found something his elite education had never offered. Perspective, a lens that revealed the world's deeper truths. Melissa Cooper, Banna Sakupur. The lieutenant's sister poured her heart into an article for the local newspaper, capturing the day's sacred weight. That Memorial Day, I saw something holy, she wrote. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of awe. When those Marines saluted Sergeant Delaney, we all felt it. The cost of sacrifice, the burden of survival, the honor of remembering. What began as a community piece was picked up by national outlets, its words resonating far beyond the town's borders. But the most profound change was quieter, unfolding at Frank's table. Veterans who had long hidden their pain, carrying the invisible scars of wars from Normandy to Kandahar, began to show up. Some wore their old uniforms, others came in jeans and flannel, but all shared an unspoken bond. They didn't often talk about the battles they'd fought. Instead, they found healing in the silences, in the knowing glances that said, "I understand." As another Memorial Day loomed, Frank sat alone in his apartment, Eleanor's letter in his hands. Her words, written in a time of uncertainty, had guided him for half a lifetime. Perhaps someday someone will remember. They had remembered, not just the soldier who'd pulled men from trenches, but the man who'd lived with quiet dignity, carrying both his medals and his grief with equal grace. He thought of the students who'd asked him what civilians should know about veterans. "Not everyone in an old uniform needs your understanding," he'd told one. "They just need you not to laugh." To another, he'd said, "Heroes don't chase titles. They leave ripples of change." And to a young man considering enlistment, he'd offered, "Salute a soldier while you can. You never know who's standing in front of you." Frank leaned back, his eyes drifting to the window. Justice, he'd learned, could be slow, but it was never absent. The world might stand against you, but if you held fast to what was right, the truth would find its way. His life, once defined by a single promise, had become a gathering place for others to find their own. And in that, he found a sweetness that tasted like home.